Welcome to Mystery Stories, where quiet villages hide extraordinary secrets and every polite conversation may conceal a mystery waiting to unfold. Tonight's tale, The Guest Who Came Back, invites you into the peaceful world of St. Mary Mead, where Miss Marple's sharp mind notices what others overlook. Settle in, relax, and let this cozy mystery guide you through whispers, memories, and a truth that refuses to remain buried. Chapter 1. The Bluebell Tea Room had rarely been so quiet for so long, which was precisely why Mrs. Finch's voice carried so clearly when she leaned forward and announced, with unmistakable satisfaction, that Hawthorn Lodge was no longer empty. Conversations paused mid-sip. Teaspoons hovered in cups. Even the soft ticking clock above the pastry counter seemed to hesitate, as though St. Mary Mead itself wished to listen more carefully. Miss Marple, seated near the window where autumn sunlight rested gently across the lace curtains, lifted her eyes with polite interest rather than surprise. News in villages never arrived suddenly. It ripened slowly through observation before anyone dared to speak it aloud. Mrs. Finch declared that a gentleman had arrived late the previous evening with 2 suitcases and a hired motor car, and that he had spoken as though returning home rather than visiting. According to the baker's boy who had delivered bread that morning, the man possessed excellent manners and an unsettling habit of looking closely at things, doors, hedges, even the church spire, as if measuring memories against reality. Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. People who truly returned home rarely examined it so carefully. Familiarity encouraged ease, not inspection. The name, when finally spoken, caused a small ripple. Edward Harrow. Miss Marple noticed Mrs. Linton's reaction immediately. The woman's hand trembled just enough to disturb the surface of her tea, sending a faint ripple toward the porcelain edge. A drop escaped onto the saucer. Mrs. Linton laughed quickly, too quickly, blaming the heat of the cup, though the tea had long cooled. Miss Marple observed without staring, her expression mild and kindly, yet her attention sharpened. Such reactions were seldom about names alone. Names carried history, and history often carried discomfort. Mrs. Finch continued eagerly, explaining that Mr. Harrow claimed to have lived in St. Mary Mead years ago as a young man. Several ladies exchanged uncertain looks. No one wished to admit forgetting someone, yet no one confidently remembered him either. Villages possessed long memories, particularly for newcomers, and the absence of clear recollection settled uneasily over the table. Miss Marple asked only one question, gently placed between sips of tea. Had he mentioned whose house he had once visited? Mrs. Finch frowned. No, he had not said. Only that the village felt smaller than he remembered. Miss Marple smiled faintly at that. Villages did not grow smaller. People's stories simply grew larger around them. Later that afternoon, walking slowly along the high street, Miss Marple noticed subtle signs of renewed curiosity everywhere. Curtains twitched more frequently. Conversations stopped as others approached. Even the grocer arranged apples with unusual distraction while discussing the arrival with a customer. The atmosphere remained polite, yet beneath it ran a thin thread of anticipation, like the hush before rain. Hawthorn Lodge stood slightly apart from the village, bordered by hedges that had grown untidy during its years of neglect. Miss Marple passed it during her walk, appearing merely interested in the autumn roses nearby. A motor car stood neatly beside the gate, recently polished. The windows were open despite the chill, suggesting someone eager to air out old spaces. She noticed luggage labels still attached to one case visible through the hallway, foreign travel, recently made. That detail lingered quietly in her thoughts. A man emerged from the doorway at that moment. Tall, well-dressed, pleasant in appearance, he carried himself with practiced ease. Mr. Edward Harrow greeted her with warm politeness, as though recognizing her without introduction. His smile was charming but measured, arriving precisely when expected rather than naturally beforehand. They exchanged a few courteous remarks. He spoke of how delightful it felt to return after so many years and mentioned remembering the village pond exactly as it had been. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. The pond had been reshaped 5 years earlier after flooding. She offered the correction gently. Mr. Harrow paused, only a moment, then laughed lightly and said time must have blurred his memories. The explanation was reasonable, yet Miss Marple noticed how carefully he studied her reaction afterward, as though assessing whether he had passed a small examination. That evening brought choir practice at the church hall, and naturally the new resident attended. Villagers welcomed him warmly. St. Mary Mead valued politeness above suspicion. Harrow spoke easily, recalling 50s and cricket matches from long ago. His recollections impressed many, yet Miss Marple detected something curious. His memories were accurate in detail, but uncertain in sequence. He described events that had indeed happened, only several years apart from when he claimed to have witnessed them. Such errors were not impossible, yet they felt assembled. During conversation, Harrow mentioned knowing Colonel Avery, whose death years earlier had cast a brief but uncomfortable shadow over the village. At the sound of the name, voices softened. The colonel had been respected, if somewhat stern, and his sudden passing had never quite settled comfortably in local memory. "I remember him distinctly," Harrow said. "A remarkable man. I spoke with him shortly before he died." The room grew unusually still. Miss Marple noticed Mrs. Linton's gaze drop to her hands. The vicar cleared his throat unnecessarily. Someone rearranged sheet music that needed no arranging. Social instinct quickly revived conversation, yet the silence lingered like an unfinished sentence. Miss Marple watched Harrow carefully. He seemed pleased by the reaction. Not openly, but with a faint alertness in his eyes, as though confirming something he had expected. After practice, small clusters formed outside beneath the cool evening sky. Gossip flowed naturally. Mrs. Hartwell remarked that Mr. Harrow possessed excellent manners for someone who had spent so long abroad. The postmistress wondered why no one remembered his family. Another villager suggested he must have visited relatives who later moved away. Miss Marple listened more than she spoke. She noticed that Harrow drifted between conversations with deliberate purpose, steering discussions toward old households, former residents, and properties that had changed ownership. His questions sounded casual but formed a pattern. He asked who had inherited certain houses, who had left the village, who had passed away. Not nostalgia, Miss Marple thought quietly. Research. As the evening ended, Harrow approached Mrs. Linton again. Their exchange was brief and polite, yet her voice sounded strained, rising slightly in pitch before she excused herself. Harrow watched her leave with an expression too thoughtful to be casual acquaintance. Walking home beneath the dim glow of street lamps, Miss Marple reflected upon human nature as she often did. People returning to old places usually sought comfort, familiar faces, remembered joys. Yet Mr. Harrow seemed interested primarily in information, particularly information tied to the past. The next morning, the baker's delivery boy mentioned that Mr. Harrow had asked detailed questions about village deaths during breakfast at the inn. Not morbidly, the boy insisted, only curious. Still, curiosity directed toward the departed, rather than the living, struck Miss Marple as significant. She sat by her window later, observing the quiet street. Mrs. Linton hurried past, walking faster than usual, her posture tense. Moments later, Harrow appeared at the far end, strolling calmly, his gaze scanning houses as though comparing them with an internal list. Miss Marple's eyes softened thoughtfully. Memory, she believed, behaved like embroidery, genuine stitches formed naturally, while false ones appeared slightly too neat, too deliberate. Mr. Harrow's recollections possessed that same careful neatness. In the afternoon, word spread that he had visited the church records office, requesting access to old parish documents. Perfectly respectable, of course. Yet unusual for someone supposedly guided by sentiment alone. As dusk settled, bells rang gently across St. Mary Mead. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the village returned to its peaceful rhythm. Yet beneath that calm, Miss Marple sensed movement, invisible but certain, like the shifting of earth before something long buried reached the surface. She lifted her teacup, smiling faintly to herself. The village believed a former resident had come home, but Miss Marple, recalling the misplaced dates, the rehearsed memories, and the fear that flickered behind Mrs. Linton's polite smile, felt quite certain of something else entirely. St. Mary Mead had not welcomed back a man. It had welcomed back a question. And as evening shadows lengthened across the quiet lane, Miss Marple knew she had just glimpsed the first shadow of murder. Chapter 2. Mrs. Hartwell declared the next morning, with enormous certainty and very little evidence, that no man ever returned to a village unless he wanted something from it. The remark was made loudly enough at the greengrocer's that 3 customers immediately abandoned their apples in favor of listening. Miss Marple, selecting pears with gentle concentration, appeared only mildly interested, yet she listened with the attentive patience that had so often rewarded her in the past. Gossip, she believed, was rarely accurate in detail, but almost always truthful in direction. The subject, naturally, was Mr. Edward Harrow. He had already become the center of conversation in St. Mary Mead, which in itself was remarkable, considering he had arrived only 2 days earlier. According to Mrs. Hartwell, he had visited the solicitor's office that morning. According to the butcher's wife, he had asked questions about former residents. According to the postmistress, he checked the morning mail with unusual attentiveness, though none had arrived for him yet. Miss Marple thanked the grocer, accepted her parcel, and stepped outside into the cool autumn air. The village moved peacefully around her, bicycles passing slowly, distant church bells marking the hour, leaves drifting across the lane, yet beneath the calm she sensed a subtle tightening, as though curiosity had begun turning into unease. She decided upon a small visit. Mrs. Linton received her politely, though with visible relief at seeing a familiar face. The sitting room was neat to the point of strain, cushions aligned too precisely, teacups already prepared though untouched. Miss Marple noticed immediately that Mrs. Linton had been pacing before her arrival. The carpet showed faint disturbed lines where footsteps had crossed repeatedly. "My dear Miss Marple," Mrs. Linton said, smiling a little too brightly, "how lovely to see you." Miss Marple explained she had come to borrow a recipe, which everyone in St. Mary Mead understood as a perfectly respectable excuse for conversation. Tea was poured, though Mrs. Linton's hands trembled slightly as she lifted the pot. They spoke first of harmless matters, the weather, church arrangements, the lateness of autumn roses, until Miss Marple gently mentioned the village's new resident. The reaction came instantly. Mrs. Linton's smile faltered before returning with effort. "Yes, Mr. Harrow. Quite charming. You remember him from before, perhaps?" Miss Marple asked lightly. "Oh no," Mrs. Linton replied quickly. "No, not at all." The speed of the denial lingered in the room longer than the words themselves. Miss Marple nodded pleasantly, though she noticed Mrs. Linton's fingers tightening around her teacup. A moment later, Mrs. Linton added, almost defensively, "Though he seems very familiar with village history." Indeed, Miss Marple thought. Too familiar. During conversation, Mrs. Linton mentioned Hawthorn Lodge had once belonged to Colonel Avery, a fact delivered casually, yet accompanied by a small pause afterward, as if awaiting reaction. Miss Marple allowed silence to encourage further speech, a method she employed often. "The Colonel's death was very sudden," Mrs. Linton said at last. "Yes," Miss Marple replied gently. "I remember the shock." Mrs. Linton looked toward the window. "Some things are best left in the past." Miss Marple smiled kindly but said nothing. People rarely spoke such sentences unless the past was already returning. After leaving, Miss Marple walked slowly toward the churchyard, where she encountered the vicar's wife arranging flowers. Naturally, conversation turned again to Mr. Harrow. The vicar's wife recalled, somewhat uncertainly, that a young visitor had stayed briefly in the village many years ago around the time of the Colonel's funeral. "He disappeared afterward," she said thoughtfully. "No one knew where he went." Miss Marple asked what his name had been. The woman hesitated. "I cannot remember, only that he seemed devoted to the Colonel." A curious detail. Devotion left stronger impressions than names. That afternoon brought a small garden gathering at Mrs. Finch's house, and Mr. Harrow attended, charming everyone with effortless politeness. He spoke warmly, laughed easily, and remembered minor details about people he had supposedly not seen in decades. Many found this flattering. Miss Marple, however, noticed something else. He watched reactions carefully. When someone mentioned village renovations, his eyes sharpened slightly. When inheritance laws were discussed jokingly, he listened with deeper attention than politeness required. His laughter arrived precisely when others laughed. Never early, never late, perfectly timed. During conversation, Miss Marple mentioned the Colonel's rose garden in passing. "Oh yes," Harrow said immediately. "Magnificent roses. I remember walking there often." Miss Marple inclined her head. How fortunate. They were removed nearly 15 years ago. A small silence followed. Harrow recovered smoothly, suggesting memory played tricks, yet a faint stiffness entered his posture. He redirected conversation quickly toward travel abroad, drawing attention away from the mistake. Miss Marple observed quietly. Genuine memory faltered naturally. Invented memory corrected itself too quickly. Later, while guests admired the garden, she overheard Harrow asking Mrs. Finch whether Hawthorn Lodge's ownership had changed hands after the Colonel's death. His tone remained casual, yet the question was precise. That evening, fresh gossip spread through the village. Mr. Harrow had visited the solicitor again and requested information about property transfers from years earlier. Perfectly legitimate, of course, yet oddly determined for someone guided only by nostalgia. Miss Marple sat by her window at twilight, reflecting. The pattern was becoming clearer. Harrow collected facts the way careful students prepared for examinations. He sought documents, timelines, inheritances, not memories, confirmations. The following morning brought another small detail. The postmistress mentioned Harrow had asked whether any registered letters from abroad had arrived for former residents connected to Hawthorn Lodge. He seemed particularly interested in old correspondence. Miss Marple thanked her and walked home thoughtfully. Letters meant records. Records meant proof. Near the lane, she saw Harrow speaking quietly with an unfamiliar gentleman beside the hedge. Their conversation stopped immediately upon noticing her approach. The stranger departed quickly, avoiding eye contact. Harrow greeted Miss Marple warmly, yet for the first time she noticed strain beneath his charm. "Settling in well?" she asked kindly. "Perfectly," he replied. "Though one realizes how much changes with time." "Yes," she said softly. "And how much does not?" For a brief moment, his smile faded, replaced by calculation, not hostility, but caution. That expression confirmed more than words ever could. As evening descended, bells echoed across St. Mary Mead once more. Windows glowed with lamplight, and ordinary life resumed its comforting rhythm. Yet conversations increasingly returned to the same subject. The returning guest. The forgotten past. The Colonel's house. Miss Marple poured herself tea and considered the small inconsistencies accumulating like scattered puzzle pieces. The misdated memories, Mrs. Linton's fear, the solicitor visits, the questions about inheritance, and the careful observation of villagers' reactions. A man returning home sought belonging. A man investigating sought answers. And Mr. Edward Harrow, she suspected, was searching not for comfort, but for something owed. She gazed out toward the distant silhouette of Hawthorn Lodge, standing dark against the fading sky. Why would a man pretend familiarity with a past that did not quite fit him? And why, above all, did Mrs. Linton look like someone waiting for an old secret to speak her name aloud? Miss Marple set down her teacup gently. Somewhere within the polite routines of St. Mary Mead, an old story was stirring again, one tied not merely to memory, but to money, fear, and unfinished business. And Miss Marple began to wonder whether the returning guest had come back to reclaim something. or to make certain that no one else could. Chapter 3. The first hint that something was amiss arrived not with drama, but with a misplaced envelope. And in St. Mary Mead, misplaced things were rarely accidental for long. The post office carried its usual gentle hum that morning, the bell above the door chiming softly as villagers entered one by one, exchanging greetings that blended business with curiosity. Miss Marple had come to purchase stamps, though she paused almost immediately upon noticing Miss Weatherby, the postmistress, examining a letter with faint puzzlement. "My memory must be failing," Miss Weatherby murmured, turning the envelope over. "I could have sworn this was meant for yesterday's collection." Miss Marple approached with polite interest. The envelope lay slightly apart from the outgoing mail, as though someone had reconsidered sending it. The handwriting was firm and deliberate, elegant but careful, the sort of writing practiced by someone wishing to appear confident. The name on the front caught her attention. The letter was addressed to Colonel Avery. Miss Marple blinked once, very slowly. The colonel had been dead for nearly a decade. Miss Weatherby explained that Mr. Harrow had brought it earlier that morning, but returned shortly afterward asking whether it had already been dispatched. When told it had not yet left, he appeared relieved and took it back, apologizing for the confusion. Yet somehow, amid the morning rush, this second envelope had remained behind. Miss Marple did not touch it. She merely observed the faint indentation where pressure from writing had marked the paper beneath. The date, she noticed, had been written and then carefully corrected. "How absent-minded we all become sometimes," she said gently. "Yes," Miss Weatherby agreed, though he seemed quite anxious about it. Anxiety over a letter to a dead man lingered curiously in Miss Marple's thoughts as she stepped back into the street. Outside, autumn sunlight warmed the pavements, and village life moved peacefully onward. Children hurried past with schoolbooks, and the baker arranged fresh loaves in the window. Everything appeared perfectly ordinary, which only made the oddness of the letter feel more pronounced. Later that morning, Miss Marple encountered Mrs. Hartwell near the church gates, eager as ever to share news. "Mr. Harrow checks the post every day," she whispered. "First thing each morning." As though waiting for something terribly important, Miss Marple smiled. "Perhaps he is." "But he receives nothing," Mrs. Hartwell added triumphantly. That detail settled quietly into Miss Marple's growing collection of observations. Waiting for letters that never arrived suggested expectation, or fear of what might arrive instead. In the afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to the vicarage, where conversation soon turned toward older village memories. The vicar's wife recalled again the period surrounding Colonel Avery's death. "There was talk at the time," she admitted softly, lowering her voice, though no one else was near. "Nothing improper, you understand. Only whispers about financial matters. Papers being sorted rather quickly afterward." Miss Marple listened attentively. Mrs. Linton, it seemed, had managed much of the colonel's correspondence and accounts during his final years. She had been trusted implicitly. Yet after his death, several documents were finalized with surprising speed, and certain arrangements benefited individuals who had remained discreetly unnamed. No scandal, the vicar's wife insisted. Only confusion. Confusion, Miss Marple thought, was often the polite word chosen when certainty felt uncomfortable. That evening brought another gathering, this time at the church hall for a charitable committee meeting. Mr. Harrow attended again, charming and attentive. Yet Miss Marple noticed his gaze frequently drift toward Mrs. Linton, not warmly, but analytically, as though studying a puzzle nearing completion. During conversation, someone produced an old photograph discovered while organizing parish records. It showed a summer 50 from many years earlier, villagers gathered beneath bunting, smiling toward the camera. A young man stood beside Colonel Avery. Miss Marple noticed the resemblance immediately. The man in the photograph bore a striking similarity to Harrow, though younger and listed beneath a different name written neatly along the border, Daniel Avery. The photograph passed casually among the guests until it reached Harrow. He laughed lightly upon seeing it. Extraordinary likeness, he said. I seem to have a double. His tone was amused, yet Miss Marple noticed his fingers tighten briefly on the photograph before handing it back. Villages do produce coincidences, she said kindly. Yes, he replied, meeting her eyes. Coincidences. The word lingered between them. As the evening continued, Miss Marple observed subtle shifts. Mrs. Linton spoke less than usual. Harrow asked careful questions about the Colonel's final weeks, phrased delicately, almost academically. Others answered politely, though discomfort flickered beneath their smiles. Later, while coats were gathered near the entrance, Miss Marple overheard Harrow speaking quietly to himself, barely above a whisper. Soon, he said. The single word carried determination rather than hope. Walking home under the dim glow of lamplight, Miss Marple reflected upon patterns forming steadily. A letter to a dead man. A photograph linking Harrow to another identity. Persistent questions about inheritance and documents. And beneath it all, a sense not of nostalgia, but preparation. The next morning brought fresh unease. The maid from Hawthorn Lodge confided to the baker that Mr. Harrow spent long hours reviewing old papers late into the night. He had also asked repeatedly whether anyone remembered disputes involving the Colonel. Miss Marple sat by her window afterward, considering human behavior as carefully as a mathematician examined numbers. People impersonated others for many reasons: affection, admiration, escape, but most often for advantage. An advantage usually followed money. She recalled the corrected date on the envelope, the hesitation before posting it, the anxiety afterward. A man writing to the dead might be confessing or rehearsing. That afternoon, she encountered Harrow again along the lane. He greeted her warmly, yet she noticed fatigue beneath his composure, as though tension had begun wearing through his charm. Settling comfortably now? She asked. Almost, he said. Some matters from the past require resolution. Yes, Miss Marple replied gently. The past is remarkably patient. He studied her for a moment, perhaps wondering how much she understood. Then he smiled again, polite and unreadable. As he walked away, Miss Marple noticed something else. He glanced back toward Hawthorn Lodge, not with affection, but with calculation. The house, she realized, was not a home to him. It was evidence. Evening settled quietly over St. Mary Mead. Smoke curled from chimneys, and distant laughter drifted through the cool air. Yet beneath the calm, Miss Marple felt certainty growing. Someone was reconstructing a story piece by piece, and stories reconstructed carefully were often meant to replace the truth. She poured herself tea and reflected on the photograph once more. Daniel Avery. The resemblance too strong to dismiss, yet Harrow had denied knowing the man beyond coincidence. Why deny resemblance unless acknowledgement carried danger? Miss Marple's gentle smile faded into thoughtful stillness. The village believed it was witnessing the return of a former guest. But perhaps, she considered, the guest who had come back was not returning at all, only arriving under a name carefully chosen. And as the evening clock struck the hour, Miss Marple felt certain she had just glimpsed the outline of a far more troubling possibility. Someone in St. Mary Mead was not merely remembering the past. Someone was attempting to rewrite it. Chapter 4. It was Mrs. Finch who first remarked, with cheerful innocence, that nothing revealed the truth about people quite so quickly as afternoon tea arranged with careful intention. The observation might have passed unnoticed had she not added, in the same breath, that she had invited several guests connected, purely by coincidence, of course, with Hawthorn Lodge's history. By the time the invitations circulated through St. Mary Mead, anticipation had already settled comfortably among the villagers. Miss Marple received hers that morning and smiled faintly, recognizing both the social opportunity and the quiet tension beneath it. The gathering took place in Mrs. Finch's drawing room, where sunlight filtered warmly through tall windows and polished silver reflected soft autumn light. Everything appeared perfectly ordinary: delicate sandwiches, carefully arranged flowers, and polite conversation drifting like music. Yet Miss Marple sensed at once that the atmosphere held a faint stiffness, as though everyone present understood that certain topics hovered just beneath the surface. Mr. Edward Harrow arrived precisely on time, carrying flowers and charm in equal measure. Mrs. Linton followed shortly afterward, her smile composed, but her eyes tired. The vicar and his wife completed the circle, along with two other long-standing residents who had known Colonel Avery years before. Miss Marple seated herself quietly, where she could observe everyone without appearing to do so. She had always believed that people revealed themselves most clearly when they believed attention rested elsewhere. Conversation began safely enough: harvest yields, church repairs, the lateness of migrating birds. Harrow contributed easily, laughing at appropriate moments. Yet Miss Marple noticed that he watched the room continuously, measuring reactions the way a chess player studied a board several moves ahead. Mrs. Finch eventually mentioned Hawthorn Lodge, praising the improvements already underway. "Yes," Harrow said pleasantly. "It feels good restoring a place with history." Mrs. Linton's teacup paused midway to her lips. Miss Marple observed the small hesitation. Not fear exactly, something closer to dread. Encouraged by polite interest, Harrow spoke about remembering visits to the lodge long ago. He described evenings spent walking the gardens with Colonel Avery. His tone sounded warm, almost nostalgic. Miss Marple waited until the conversation settled before speaking gently. The Colonel's gardens were especially beautiful before the storm that year. "The storm?" Harrow asked. "Yes," she said. "The night he died. Such dreadful weather." A subtle shift passed through the room. The vicar nodded slowly. Mrs. Finch murmured agreement. Harrow hesitated only briefly. "Curious," he said lightly. "I remember the evening as perfectly clear." Silence followed, not dramatic, but uncomfortable enough that teaspoons sounded unusually loud against china. Miss Marple lowered her gaze thoughtfully. Weather, she reflected, was rarely forgotten during significant moments. Storms especially lingered vividly in memory. Mrs. Linton set her cup down with visible care. "I believe I should take some air," she said, rising quickly and leaving the room before anyone could object. Harrow watched her departure with sharp attention before resuming his smile. Conversation resumed, though its warmth had faded slightly. The vicar recalled the confusion following the Colonel's passing, papers needing sorting, estate matters resolved swiftly. Harrow listened intently, asking gentle questions about how decisions had been made. Miss Marple noticed his interest sharpen whenever finances were mentioned. After tea, guests moved into the garden. Autumn leaves drifted lazily across the lawn, and the peaceful setting contrasted strangely with the tension lingering among the group. Miss Marple walked slowly along the flower beds, eventually finding herself near Mrs. Finch, who whispered that Mrs. Linton seemed quite unwell lately. "Too much worry, perhaps," Mrs. Finch suggested. "Yes," Miss Marple replied softly. "Worry has a way of returning when least expected." At that moment, raised voices carried faintly from beyond the hedge bordering the lane. Miss Marple paused, appearing merely interested in a rosebud, while listening carefully. Harrow stood speaking to a man partially hidden by shadow, a stranger unfamiliar to the village. Their conversation was low but urgent. "You were never meant to know," Harrow said sharply. The stranger responded too quietly to hear clearly, then departed quickly upon noticing movement nearby. Harrow turned back toward the garden, his expression smoothing instantly into polite composure. When he rejoined the group, Miss Marple noticed a trace of mud along the edge of his shoe, fresh and dark despite the dry pathways. Later, as guests prepared to leave, Mrs. Linton returned indoors, pale but composed. She avoided Harrow's gaze entirely. Miss Marple approached her gently. "My dear, you look tired." "It is nothing," Mrs. Linton replied quickly. "Only memories." Memories again, Miss Marple thought. The word appeared frequently, where truth preferred to hide. That evening, walking home, Miss Marple passed near Hawthorn Lodge. The gates stood slightly ajar. Moonlight revealed faint impressions in the soil beside the path, footprints smaller than Harrow's, recent and hurried. Someone else had visited. The following morning confirmed her suspicion. The gardener employed temporarily at the lodge mentioned seeing visitors late at night, though Mr. Harrow claimed no guests had arrived. Miss Marple listened with quiet interest. Denials were often more revealing than admissions. She spent part of the afternoon reviewing parish recollections with the vicar, piecing together the timeline of Colonel Avery's final days. The estate, she learned, had transferred ownership unusually quickly, finalized through documents prepared under Mrs. Linton's supervision. Efficient work, the vicar remarked. Perhaps too efficient, Miss Marple thought privately. As dusk settled, another small detail emerged. The maid from Hawthorn Lodge reported overhearing Harrow arguing alone, repeating the words, "It should have been settled years ago." Such statements suggested unfinished business, rather than nostalgia. Miss Marple returned home and prepared tea, her thoughts aligning gradually. The incorrect weather memory, the financial inquiries, Mrs. Linton's fear, the mysterious visitor, and now hidden footsteps near the lodge, each detail small alone, yet together forming a pattern. Someone was searching for confirmation of an old event, and someone else was terrified that the search might succeed. She gazed toward the distant outline of Hawthorn Lodge beneath the evening sky. The house seemed watchful, as though guarding secrets buried not only in memory, but perhaps in earth itself. Villages preserved history quietly, she reflected. Nothing truly disappeared, it merely waited until circumstances allowed it to surface again. Miss Marple lifted her teacup slowly, her expression thoughtful. The past surrounding Colonel Avery's death was no longer resting peacefully. It was being disturbed, carefully, deliberately, by hands determined to uncover something long concealed. And as shadows lengthened across St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple felt certain of one thing. The returning guest was not alone in seeking the truth. Someone else had already begun trying to hide it again. Chapter 5. The gardener's complaint reached Miss Marple before breakfast, carried gently through village conversation as such things always were. According to young Thomas Reed, temporarily employed at Hawthorn Lodge, someone had insisted upon rearranging part of the garden despite the season being entirely wrong for planting. The remark itself might have seemed trivial, yet Mrs. Hartwell repeated it with unusual emphasis while purchasing marmalade at the grocer's, adding that the new flower bed had appeared almost overnight. Miss Marple listened with quiet interest. Gardens, she believed, revealed human intentions more honestly than drawing rooms ever could. People planted flowers for beauty, certainly, but they also planted them to cover what lay beneath. Later that morning, she chose a walking route that passed naturally along the lane near Hawthorn Lodge. The autumn air carried the faint scent of damp soil, and as she approached the hedge, she noticed immediately the patch in question. Fresh earth stood darker than the surrounding ground, hastily turned and unevenly leveled. Newly planted flowers sat too closely together, their arrangement lacking the patience of genuine gardening. Miss Marple paused, as though admiring the blooms. Her eyes, however, lingered on the soil. It had been dug recently, very recently, and not by an experienced hand. Mr. Harrow emerged from the house at that moment, greeting her warmly. Improving the garden already, she remarked pleasantly. "Yes," he said quickly. Restoring it to what it once was, Miss Marple nodded, though she noticed his gaze flick briefly toward the disturbed patch, as if ensuring nothing appeared out of place. His tone carried enthusiasm, yet beneath it lay tension, the kind belonging to someone guarding a task unfinished. They spoke briefly of harmless matters. Harrow mentioned enjoying the quiet of the village, though he added that certain matters required attention before he could fully relax. "The past has a way of demanding closure," he said. "Indeed," Miss Marple replied gently, "though it rarely accepts hurried arrangements." For a moment, something unreadable crossed his expression before he smiled again. As she continued her walk, Miss Marple reflected on the garden. Fresh soil suggested concealment or recovery. Either possibility implied urgency. By afternoon, new gossip had surfaced. Mrs. Linton, it seemed, had once served not merely as acquaintance to Colonel Avery, but as his personal secretary during his final years. She had handled correspondence, accounts, and private documents. The revelation emerged casually during a conversation at the library, yet its importance struck Miss Marple immediately. Trust granted such access, and trust, when misplaced, often led to quiet scandal rather than public accusation. Miss Marple paid Mrs. Linton another visit under friendly pretense. This time the woman appeared exhausted, shadows beneath her eyes betraying sleepless nights. "You must not worry yourself," Miss Marple said kindly after tea was served. "I am not worried," Mrs. Linton insisted, though her voice lacked conviction. During conversation, Miss Marple mentioned the Colonel's efficiency in financial matters. Mrs. Linton stiffened slightly. "He relied on me greatly," she admitted, "after his health declined." "And after his death?" Mrs. Linton hesitated. There were many papers to finalize. Everything had to be done quickly. Quickly again, Miss Marple noted inwardly. Speed often benefited someone. Before leaving, she observed an unopened envelope resting near Mrs. Linton's writing desk. The seal had been broken and resealed poorly, suggesting nervous handling. Mrs. Linton noticed her glance and turned the envelope face down at once. Fear, Miss Marple thought gently, was becoming impossible for the woman to hide. That evening brought another small disturbance. The maid from Hawthorn Lodge confided to Mrs. Finch that she had overheard Mr. Harrow arguing with someone late at night, though no visitor had been officially received. The conversation had taken place near the garden. He said, "You promised it would remain buried," the maid whispered. The phrase settled heavily in Miss Marple's thoughts. Buried. The following morning, the village awoke to news that Mrs. Linton had fallen suddenly ill after receiving an anonymous note delivered by hand. The doctor assured everyone it was exhaustion rather than serious illness, yet the timing troubled Miss Marple deeply. She visited briefly, finding Mrs. Linton pale but alert. "It is nothing," the woman insisted again. "Only nerves." Miss Marple sat beside her quietly. "Sometimes nerves arise when truths approach the surface," she said gently. Mrs. Linton turned away, unable to reply. Walking home afterward, Miss Marple arranged her observations carefully. Harrow's arrival, his research into inheritance, the garden disturbance, Mrs. Linton's fear, anonymous messages, late-night arguments. Each detail pointed toward an event long past, but not forgotten. Near the churchyard, she encountered the gardener again, who mentioned that Mr. Harrow had dismissed him early the previous evening to work alone outdoors. Digging again, he was, the young man said, though he claimed he was planting bulbs. Bulbs, Miss Marple reflected, were rarely planted in such haste. As twilight approached, she took another quiet walk past Hawthorn Lodge. Lamps glowed inside, and Harrow's silhouette moved restlessly from room to room. The disturbed flower bed appeared slightly altered since morning. Soil pressed more firmly, flowers adjusted as though someone feared scrutiny. Miss Marple paused at the gate, listening to the stillness. Somewhere nearby a branch snapped softly. She turned but saw no one, only shadows between trees. Someone else was watching the house. Returning home, she poured tea and allowed her thoughts to settle into clearer form. Harrow was searching for something hidden, not wealth directly, evidence, proof of an earlier crime, perhaps. Yet his urgency suggested fear that another person might find it first. And Mrs. Linton's illness, arriving immediately after a mysterious note, implied pressure from someone determined to silence anxiety before it became confession. Miss Marple considered human nature carefully. People who returned to expose wrongdoing often behaved with righteous certainty. Harrow, however, behaved like a man racing against time, which meant he feared discovery as much as he sought it. Outside, evening bells rang softly across St. Mary Mead, their familiar sound bringing comfort to most listeners. To Miss Marple, however, they marked the steady passing of moments toward inevitable revelation. She gazed toward the dark outline of Hawthorn Lodge once more. If something had been buried in that garden, it was not merely an object, but a memory, one powerful enough to frighten the living even years later. And as she set down her teacup, Miss Marple felt a quiet but undeniable certainty forming. The returning guest was not searching for a forgotten crime. He was searching for proof that someone else knew the truth before he did. Chapter 6. The rain arrived softly during the night, the kind that settled over St. Mary Mead without drama, leaving the morning washed clean and unusually quiet. By breakfast time, however, the village carried a subtle restlessness. Mrs. Hartwell remarked at the bakery that Mr. Harrow had left unusually early, taking the first motor car toward the nearby town. Such departures rarely passed unnoticed, particularly when connected to a man already occupying the center of village curiosity. Miss Marple received the news calmly, though it confirmed a decision she had already begun forming. Certain questions, she believed, could no longer be answered within the village alone. Some truths required records, and records, unlike people, rarely altered their stories out of embarrassment or fear. By mid-morning, she herself had arranged a modest journey to the county archives, explaining to acquaintances that she wished to review parish history for entirely harmless interests. The clerk welcomed her warmly, accustomed to visitors seeking genealogies or property histories. Miss Marple requested documents connected to Colonel Avery and Hawthorn Lodge, her tone gentle and unhurried. Time passed quietly as she examined faded ledgers and carefully preserved files. Gradually, small inconsistencies emerged, each insignificant alone but troubling together. Colonel Avery had indeed possessed a nephew, Daniel Avery, who had traveled abroad many years earlier following a family disagreement. Records showed correspondence abruptly ending, followed by official notice of Daniel's reported death overseas. Miss Marple read the entry twice. The date aligned precisely with the period shortly before Colonel Avery's own death. More curious still, another document listed Edward Harrow, not as family, but as a paid assistant employed by the colonel during his final years. The handwriting describing him noted reliability and discretion. Miss Marple sat very still for several moments. Edward Harrow had not been a returning relative. He had been an employee. The distinction changed everything. She continued reading. Shortly before the colonel's death, the will had been altered. Funds were redirected through administrative channels managed temporarily by Mrs. Linton. Nothing illegal appeared on paper, yet the timing felt unusually convenient. Outside, rain tapped gently against the windows as realization formed slowly, like an image emerging through mist. If Daniel Avery had died abroad, then who had returned to St. Mary Mead claiming familiarity with the family? Miss Marple closed the file softly. The answer felt dangerously close. Upon returning to the village that afternoon, she learned Mr. Harrow had also come back, appearing unsettled according to the innkeeper. He had asked whether anyone had been inquiring about him, an unusual question for someone supposedly at ease among old acquaintances. Miss Marple encountered him later along the lane near the church. He greeted her politely, though fatigue shadowed his expression. For the first time, charm seemed effortful rather than natural. "You have been away," she observed. "Business matters," he replied. "One must occasionally confirm facts." "Yes," she said gently, "facts are stubborn things." He studied her carefully, as though sensing a shift he could not yet define. After a brief silence, he spoke again, lowering his voice slightly. "You are a perceptive lady, Miss Marple. I suspect you understand more than most." She smiled kindly. "Understanding comes slowly. People often reveal themselves without meaning to." For a moment, something close to confession flickered across his face. That evening, he requested to speak with her privately. The invitation arrived through the maid, polite but urgent. Miss Marple accepted. Hawthorn Lodge felt different at night. Lamps cast long shadows across walls, still bearing traces of former grandeur. Harrow led her into the sitting room, pacing briefly before speaking. "I believe Colonel Avery was murdered," he said abruptly. Miss Marple listened without interruption. He explained that he was, in truth, Daniel Avery, the colonel's estranged nephew, returned to uncover the truth about his uncle's death. According to him, irregularities in financial documents suggested poisoning concealed as illness. He claimed Mrs. Linton had managed accounts suspiciously and must know more than she admitted. His voice carried conviction, yet Miss Marple noticed small hesitations, uncertainty regarding family memories, vague descriptions of childhood details that genuine recollection would have supplied effortlessly. "You have come for justice, then?" she asked gently. "Yes," he said firmly. "Justice long overdue." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, though inwardly she felt unease deepen. The confession arrived too neatly, as though prepared in advance. True grief rarely organized itself so cleanly. As she rose to leave, she noticed papers spread across a nearby desk, copies of wills, letters, and notes arranged methodically. Among them lay a passport bearing the name Edward Harrow, not Daniel Avery. Outside, night air felt unusually cold. Miss Marple walked home slowly, her thoughts aligning with increasing clarity. Harrow's story explained much, yet not enough. His knowledge of family matters lacked intimacy. His memories contained studied precision rather than lived experience. The following morning brought sudden news. Mrs. Linton intended to leave the village immediately, claiming she needed rest with relatives elsewhere. The announcement spread rapidly, accompanied by speculation and concern. Miss Marple visited her at once. Suitcases stood packed near the door. Mrs. Linton appeared frightened rather than relieved. "He knows," she whispered suddenly. "Who?" Miss Marple asked gently. Mrs. Linton hesitated, then shook her head. "I cannot stay. The past should have remained buried." Miss Marple placed a reassuring hand over hers. "Running rarely quiets the past, my dear." Tears gathered briefly in the woman's eyes before she turned away. Leaving the house, Miss Marple felt certainty settle firmly at last. Harrow's return had forced old fears into motion, but his claim to be Daniel Avery rang false. The archives had confirmed the nephew's death, which meant the man accusing others might himself be the greatest deception present. She walked toward the village green, observing ordinary life continuing peacefully. Children playing, shopkeepers chatting, bells marking the hour, unaware of the careful web tightening around them. Human nature, she reflected, often revealed itself through ambition disguised as righteousness. A man seeking justice welcomed scrutiny. A man seeking advantage feared it. And Edward Harrow feared something profoundly. As evening approached, Miss Marple paused once more with her teacup by the window, watching distant lights glow at Hawthorn Lodge. The returning guest claimed to expose a murderer, but what troubled her most was not his accusation, it was the subtle uncertainty in his eyes whenever truth came too close. Because Miss Marple now suspected a far more dangerous possibility. The man hunting a killer might himself be hiding behind the darkest lie of all. Chapter 7. The announcement that Miss Marple intended to host a small evening gathering traveled through St. Mary Mead with remarkable speed, though no one could later explain precisely how the news began. By late afternoon, it was widely understood that several individuals connected with Hawthorn Lodge had been invited for what Miss Marple described simply as a clarifying conversation. The phrase sounded harmless enough, yet villagers sensed significance beneath its gentleness. Invitations from Miss Marple rarely concerned idle social calls. The drawing room glowed warmly that evening, lamplight soft against polished furniture, the atmosphere calm and welcoming. Tea had been prepared with careful attention, and chairs arranged in a loose circle rather than formal rows, a subtle choice encouraging openness rather than defense. Miss Marple believed people spoke more honestly when they did not feel examined. Mrs. Linton arrived first, pale but composed, her movements hesitant as though she expected unpleasant news. The vicar and his wife followed, offering polite conversation that failed entirely to disguise their curiosity. Finally, Mr. Edward Harrow entered, confident as ever, though Miss Marple noticed the quick sweep of his eyes across the room, assessing exits, expressions, possibilities. Outside, evening bells faded into silence. Inside, the room settled into expectant quiet. Miss Marple poured tea herself, allowing ordinary gestures to soften tension. Conversation began lightly. Village matters, weather, small domestic concerns, until she set her cup down with gentle finality. "I have been thinking," she said kindly, "about how very strange memory can be." No one spoke. Harrow leaned slightly forward. Particularly, she continued, when several people remember the same event differently. She spoke calmly, almost conversationally, recounting small details gathered over recent days. The storm on the night of Colonel Avery's death. The speed with which estate papers had been finalized. The returning guest whose memories were accurate yet misplaced in time. Harrow smiled faintly. Surely small errors prove nothing. Quite so, Miss Marple agreed pleasantly. Until they begin forming a pattern, she described the garden disturbance at Hawthorn Lodge, the late-night visitor, and the anxious letter addressed to a man long deceased. Each detail was delivered gently, without accusation. Yet together they created a quiet weight filling the room. Mrs. Linton clasped her hands tightly. The vicar shifted uneasily. Harrow's expression remained composed, though a faint tension appeared around his eyes. Miss Marple turned toward Mrs. Linton. "You were trusted greatly by Colonel Avery. Were you not?" "Yes," she whispered. "You managed his financial papers?" A nod. "And after his death, certain arrangements were completed quickly." Mrs. Linton's voice trembled. "I followed instructions." "Indeed," Miss Marple said softly. "Instructions given under considerable pressure." Harrow spoke sharply. "Are we suggesting wrongdoing now?" Miss Marple smiled gently. Only understanding, she turned back toward him. "You told me you were Daniel Avery, the Colonel's nephew." "Yes." "I visited the county archives yesterday. The silence that followed felt heavier than accusation. Records show Daniel Avery died abroad many years ago," she said calmly. Mrs. Linton gasped softly. The vicar stared at Harrow in disbelief. Harrow's smile faded slightly but did not disappear. "Records can be mistaken." Occasionally, Miss Marple agreed, though employment records are usually reliable. "You served Colonel Avery as an assistant, Mr. Harrow." "A trusted one." The room seemed to contract around them. She continued gently, laying each observation carefully into place. Harrow's knowledge came from proximity, not family connection. His familiarity with village events had been learned through listening rather than living. His return under another identity allowed him to claim interest in inheritance while directing suspicion elsewhere. Harrow rose slowly. "This is speculation." "Not entirely," Miss Marple replied. "You returned searching for something hidden, proof connected to the Colonel's death. Yet you also planted evidence in the garden, hoping discovery would confirm your accusations." Mrs. Linton shook her head weakly. "I never harmed him." Miss Marple nodded reassuringly. "No, my dear, you did not." She explained how the Colonel had indeed been poisoned gradually through medicine administered during illness, but not by Mrs. Linton. The financial irregularities had been manipulations encouraged by someone who understood the accounts intimately, someone who stood to lose everything if dismissed from employment. Harrow's calm began to fracture. "You cannot prove that." Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. "You dismissed the gardener to dig alone. You searched for the original medicine bottle because you feared it still existed, and you returned pretending to be the heir so suspicion would fall naturally upon those connected to finances rather than yourself." The vicar's wife covered her mouth in shock. Harrow laughed suddenly, though the sound lacked warmth. "Even if that were true, you still lack one thing: evidence." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. "Quite right." She paused, allowing quiet to deepen. "There remains one question," she said softly. "Who placed the bottle beneath the elm tree recently?" "You did not bury it originally, only retrieved and replaced it." For the first time, uncertainty crossed Harrow's face. Miss Marple continued, "Someone else knew the truth already. Someone who watched you return and understood what you were attempting." All eyes turned instinctively toward Mrs. Linton, who looked utterly bewildered. I know nothing about any bottle," she whispered. Miss Marple studied the room thoughtfully. The final piece still hovered just beyond reach, a small kindness twisted into danger. She rose slowly, walking toward the window where evening shadows gathered. "The Colonel trusted many people," she said quietly. "And sometimes loyalty leads individuals to make decisions meant to protect others, decisions that later become misunderstandings." Harrow's composure slipped further. "You're guessing?" "Not guessing," Miss Marple said gently. Observing, she turned back toward the group. "The truth is almost complete. One last detail remains, a small act overlooked at the time, yet decisive now. Outside, wind stirred faintly against the glass. Inside, no one moved." Miss Marple folded her hands calmly. "The answer," she said softly, "depends upon understanding why someone tried not to hide the past, but to correct it." Harrow's confidence faltered completely for the first time, and Miss Marple knew that the final truth, the one capable of ending years of silence, was now only moments away from revealing itself. Chapter 8. The room remained perfectly still after Miss Marple's last words, as though even the air hesitated to move before the truth settled into place. Outside, evening had deepened into full night, and the gentle ticking of the mantel clock sounded unusually loud. No one spoke. Every gaze rested upon Miss Marple, whose calm expression carried neither triumph nor accusation, only quiet certainty. She resumed her seat slowly, folding her hands in her lap as though continuing an ordinary conversation over tea. "It is curious," she began softly, "how often crimes depend not upon grand plans, but upon small assumptions. People believe others will overlook tiny details. A date remembered wrongly, a habit misunderstood, a kindness taken for weakness." Her eyes moved toward Mr. Harrow. "You returned to St. Mary Mead believing time had softened memory. In many ways, you were correct. The village remembered Colonel Avery fondly, but not precisely. You expected uncertainty to protect you." Harrow stood rigid near the fireplace, his earlier confidence replaced by watchful tension. Miss Marple continued gently, her tone warm enough to soothe, yet steady enough to hold attention. "You were not Daniel Avery. The real nephew died abroad, as records confirm. But you knew the family well because you served the Colonel closely. You understood his routines, his health, and most importantly, his medicine." Mrs. Linton closed her eyes briefly, as if bracing herself. "The Colonel trusted you," Miss Marple said. "He intended to dismiss you, however, quietly and respectfully, after discovering irregularities in certain financial matters. You feared disgrace and loss, and so you began altering his medication gradually, knowing his illness would conceal the change." The vicar inhaled sharply. Harrow said nothing. "The death appeared natural," Miss Marple continued. "No suspicion lingered long enough to trouble anyone deeply. Mrs. Linton, overwhelmed with administrative responsibilities, finalized documents quickly, precisely as you encouraged her to do. She believed she was honoring the Colonel's wishes." Mrs. Linton's voice trembled. "I never imagined." "No," Miss Marple said kindly. "You did not. Your only mistake was trusting too readily." She turned again toward Harrow. "Years passed. Yet you discovered something alarming, a possibility that evidence might still exist. Perhaps a bottle misplaced rather than destroyed. Perhaps a memory someone else retained. Fear, once awakened, rarely sleeps again." Harrow's composure cracked slightly. "You cannot prove any of this." Miss Marple nodded calmly. "Proof often arrives through behavior rather than objects. You returned under another identity to control the narrative. By claiming to be Daniel Avery seeking justice, you directed suspicion toward Mrs. Linton and the estate arrangements. If blame settled upon financial confusion, your own actions would remain buried forever." Silence pressed heavily around the room. "You searched the garden because you remembered hiding the original medicine bottle there, Years ago, she said. But when you dug, you discovered something unexpected. It had already been disturbed. Harrow's eyes flickered. Yes, Miss Marple continued gently. Someone else had found it first. All attention shifted instinctively again. The person who discovered it, she said, did not understand its full meaning at the time. They only sensed something wrong and hid it again out of fear of causing scandal. She turned toward the vicar's wife, who looked startled. You once told me, Miss Marple said kindly, that you walked often in the colonel's garden after his death, praying for peace. You noticed disturbed soil and uncovered a bottle, which you believed related to medical treatment. Unsure what it meant, you buried it again beneath the elm tree. The woman gasped softly. I thought it unimportant. I did not wish to upset anyone. A kindness, Miss Marple said gently. Though kindness sometimes delays justice. Harrow's breathing grew uneven. When you returned recently, Miss Marple continued, you realized someone else might have seen what you hid. That is why you rushed to recover it and replant the garden, not to expose a crime, but to control its discovery. The final calm left his face. You planted suspicion carefully, she said. Anonymous notes. Questions about inheritance. Pressure upon Mrs. Linton. You hoped fear would make her appear guilty. Mrs. Linton began to weep quietly, relief and shock mingling together. Miss Marple's voice softened further. But deception always carries one flaw. It requires perfect memory. And yours, Mr. Harrow, was learned rather than lived. You remembered facts, but not feelings. Storms forgotten. Dates misplaced. Reactions studied instead of natural. For a long moment, Harrow said nothing. Then his shoulders sagged slightly, as though an invisible weight had finally settled upon him. I never meant, he began, stopping midway. No one ever does, Miss Marple said gently. Yet intention does not change consequence. The room remained silent as truth completed its quiet work. At last, Harrow gave a faint, defeated laugh. I thought time would protect me, he said hoarsely. Everyone had moved on. Time rarely protects, Miss Marple replied. It merely waits. Footsteps sounded outside as the constable, previously summoned discreetly by the vicar, entered quietly. Harrow did not resist. His charm had vanished entirely, replaced by exhaustion. As he was led away, the tension within the room dissolved into fragile relief. Mrs. Linton wiped her eyes, trembling but freed from the invisible burden she had carried for years. I shall never forgive myself for trusting him, she whispered. Miss Marple reached gently for her hand. Trust is not a fault, my dear. Only its betrayal belongs to the guilty. Gradually, conversation returned in hushed tones. The vicar spoke softly with his wife, who still looked shaken by her unintended role. Outside, night air moved peacefully through the village, untouched by the drama that had quietly unfolded. Later, when the guests departed and silence returned, Miss Marple stood near the window, watching lamplight glow across St. Mary Mead. Hawthorn Lodge lay dark once more, its secrets finally released. Villages, she reflected, possessed long memories even when people believed otherwise. Truth did not vanish, it simply waited for patience, observation, and gentle persistence. The bells began ringing in the distance, marking the late hour. Their sound carried calm reassurance, restoring familiar rhythm after disturbance. Miss Marple lifted her teacup, smiling faintly to herself. Evil rarely arrived as a stranger, she thought. More often it grew quietly beside ordinary life, hidden behind politeness and charm until circumstances allowed it to return. And tonight, St. Mary Mead could rest again, because the guest who came back had finally been revealed not as a memory restored, but as a lie brought patiently into the light. The mystery was finished, the truth spoken, and peace, delicate but genuine, settled once more over the village as though it had never truly left at all. The following morning arrived with a calm so gentle that it seemed the village itself had decided to breathe more easily. Sunlight rested warmly upon the rooftops of St. Mary Mead, and the familiar sounds of ordinary life returned. Milk bottles placed at doors, quiet greetings exchanged along the lane, and the distant laughter of children walking towards school. If one had not known better, nothing at all appeared changed. Yet beneath the peaceful routine lay a subtle feeling of release, as though a long-held tension had quietly dissolved during the night. News of Mr. Harrow's confession spread slowly and respectfully, softened by the village's natural kindness. No one spoke loudly of scandal. Instead, conversations carried sympathy for Colonel Avery, for Mrs. Linton, and even, in a cautious way, for the man whose ambition had led him into deception. St. Mary Mead preferred understanding to judgment, and life resumed its gentle rhythm with remarkable grace. Miss Marple sat by her window with her morning tea, observing the familiar street. She watched Mrs. Linton walk past at an unhurried pace, pausing to speak with neighbors without the shadow of fear that had followed her for days. Relief had changed her posture. She seemed lighter, almost younger. The vicar's wife stopped nearby to admire late autumn flowers, and their quiet conversation carried the warmth of friendship restored. Hawthorn Lodge stood silent once more. Its windows reflected pale sunlight, no longer watchful or uneasy. Soon, it was said, the house would be sold again, perhaps to a family seeking peace rather than answers. Miss Marple thought this fitting. Houses, like people, deserved the chance to begin anew once truth had been spoken. She reflected gently upon the events that had unfolded. The mystery had never depended upon dramatic clues or grand revelations. Instead, it had rested in small human details. A trembling hand, a memory slightly misplaced, a question asked too carefully. Such things were easily overlooked, yet together they told a story more honest than any confession. Human nature, she believed, remained wonderfully consistent. Kindness inspired trust, ambition invited risk, and guilt revealed itself in the smallest inconsistencies. Mr. Harrow had relied upon cleverness, yet he had underestimated something far simpler: the quiet attention of those who truly observed others. The church bells rang softly across the village, marking the hour. Their sound carried comfort, reminding everyone that time continued forward regardless of sorrow or wrongdoing. Miss Marple smiled faintly, lifting her teacup. Peace in St. Mary Mead did not mean the absence of darkness. Rather, it meant the presence of people willing to notice when something felt wrong and patient enough to understand why. Truth, she reflected, rarely shouted. It waited politely until someone cared enough to listen. Outside, leaves drifted slowly along the lane, caught briefly by sunlight before settling to rest. Another mystery had ended. Another secret laid gently to sleep. Life would continue. Tea would be poured, gossip shared, and ordinary days treasured once more. And Miss Marple, watching the village she knew so well, felt certain of one quiet truth above all others: no secret ever truly disappeared in St. Mary Mead. It merely waited, patiently and politely, until the right moment and the right observer allowed it to be seen at last.